The pen was already in Lenora Whitfield's hand when she stopped. She had been moving through the motions of surrender for so long that she had nearly forgotten there was another way to exist. The paper spread across the rough-hewn desk in the front room of the Bailey ranch house smelled of ink and finality, and the lawyer sitting across from her, a narrow man named Stoddard with wire-rimmed spectacles, and the practiced smile of someone who profited from other people's misfortune, had already uncapped his pen and was waiting with the patient satisfaction of a vulture who had circled long enough to know the animal below was done. "All you need to do is sign there, Miss Whitfield," Stoddard said, tapping the bottom line of the transfer document with one thin finger. "3 signatures, one on the deed transfer, one on the lien release, and one on the letter of voluntary relinquishment. 15 minutes and this whole unfortunate business is behind you." The room smelled like pine resin and wood smoke. Outside, through the single window framed with plain cotton curtains, Lenora could see the land, miles of it. The rolling amber grassland her father had broken his back for, the creek line that bent like a silver ribbon between 2 ridges, the horse pasture where 3 mares stood perfectly still in the afternoon sun as though they were carved from the landscape itself. Her hand was trembling. She had not noticed until that moment. And then the door opened. Clarence Bailey did not knock. He came through the door the way men who have worked their whole lives on open land move through narrow spaces, without ceremony but without carelessness either, with an awareness of the room that was immediate and complete. He stopped when he saw her sitting there. He saw the pen. He saw Stoddard. He saw the papers, and something passed across his face that was not simply surprise. It was something deeper, something that looked disturbingly like pain. "What is this?" His voice was low and careful, the way a man speaks when he is controlling something that wants very badly not to be controlled. Stoddard cleared his throat. "Mr. Bailey, we discussed the terms of the arrangement. I am not talking to you," Clarence said, and his eyes did not leave Lenora's face. Lenora set the pen down. She was not sure why. It felt like the most significant thing she had done in months. "I came to sign the deed over to the creditors," she said. Her voice was steadier than her hand had been. "As agreed." Clarence crossed the room in 4 strides and placed his broad, calloused hand flat on top of the documents, not dramatically, not aggressively, simply with a finality that matched the ink on the page, weight meeting weight. "Don't," he said. That single word cracked something open in the room that neither of them had the language yet to name. Lenora Whitfield had ridden into Jasper Creek, Texas, in the last week of October in the year 1882, on a rented horse from the livery stable in Caldwell, because the stagecoach did not run to towns as small as Jasper Creek anymore, and she had told herself the entire 40-mile ride that she felt nothing, that the land was just land, that the Whitfield name on the deed of the property now called the Whitfield Creek acreage was just a name, and names did not bind you to anything you could not walk away from. She had believed herself almost completely. She was 26 years old, the only surviving child of Thomas Whitfield, who had died the previous spring of a lung ailment that had been coming for him since the silver mine cave-in of 1878 had filled his chest with dust. Thomas had left behind 1 daughter, 2 unsettled debts, and 1,700 acres of the most beautiful land in 3 counties, all of it mortgaged so thoroughly against loans from the Caldwell Bank and Trust and 1 private creditor named Harlan Voss that it might as well have been Harlan Voss's name on the deed already. Lenora had spent 4 months in San Antonio trying to find another way. She had been teaching school there since she was 22, having left the ranch after her mother's death because the silence of all that open space with just her father in it had become unbearable, and because there was a part of her that had always believed she was made for something more contained, something with walls and books and the clean logic of arithmetic. She had been moderately happy in San Antonio. She had a small apartment above a dry goods store, a classroom of 32 students who needed her, and a life that fit inside something she could manage. Then Thomas Whitfield died and the letters started arriving, first from the bank, formal and cold. Then from Harlan Voss's lawyer, which were formal and considerably less cold, carrying in their careful legal language the unmistakable warmth of a threat. The estate owed nearly $4,000 across the two debts, and the collateral was the land. The message was simple: settle the debt, or the land transfers to satisfy it. Lenora could not settle the debt. A schoolteacher in 1882 earned $40 a month in a good situation. She had saved $300 in 4 years, which felt like an enormous sum when measured against her monthly expenses, and a very small sum measured against $4,000. She had written to every relative she knew of, which amounted to one cousin in Missouri who wrote back with genuine sympathy, and $3 enclosed. She had inquired, with tremendous personal cost to her dignity, at 2 banks in San Antonio about a loan to cover the debt, and both had declined with the practiced gentleness of institutions that found it easier to say no to women. So she had come to sign it away. But before she could reach the lawyers in Caldwell, she had received a letter from a man named Clarence Bailey. The letter had been forwarded through the bank, which was unusual enough that she read it twice. It was brief and plain-spoken. Miss Whitfield, my name is Clarence Bailey, and I run the Bailey Ranch operation adjacent to your father's property on the eastern boundary line. I was acquainted with your father for 11 years, and I respected him greatly. I have heard through the county office that the estate may be transferred to Harlan Voss in settlement of debt. I would like to speak with you before that happens. I have a proposal that may be of interest. If you come to Jasper Creek, I will provide room and board during your stay at no cost to you. The decision is entirely yours. That was the whole letter. No flattery, no false promises, no elaborate explanation. She had almost thrown it away. She had not thrown it away, which was the one decision in the whole long chain of decisions leading to this moment that she still could not entirely explain to herself. She had told herself it was pragmatic. The ride to Jasper Creek was 40 miles, which was on the way to Caldwell, and if the man had a real proposal, it would cost her nothing but an afternoon to hear it, and if it was foolishness, she would continue to Caldwell and sign the papers there just the same. But when she rode onto the Bailey Ranch property and saw the land, her father's land adjacent to it, the familiar ridge line, the same creek she had waded in as a child with her dress hem bunched in her fists, she had felt something in her chest that she was wholly unprepared for. It was grief, but it was grief twisted around something else, something that was almost its opposite. It was the sudden and violent recognition that this place was alive in her in a way that San Antonio, for all its contained comfort, had never been. She had been brought to the Bailey house by a ranch hand named Ellis, who was about 60 years old, and had the sun-darkened face of a man who had spent every decade of his adult life outdoors, and who had offered her water and a place to sit as though she were arriving at a family home rather than a business meeting, which had confused and disarmed her in equal measure. Clarence Bailey had come to meet her from the direction of the horse pasture, pulling off work gloves as he walked. He was 34 years old, solidly built in the way that came from actual labor rather than deliberate exercise, with dark brown hair that needed cutting and steady gray eyes that assessed her with directness rather than the appraising quality she had learned to brace against when men looked at her. He shook her hand rather than tipping his hat, which was a small thing but registered in her as significant. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I haven't agreed to anything," she answered immediately. A flicker of something that might have been amusement crossed his face and disappeared. "No," he said, "you haven't. Come inside and let me tell you what I'm thinking." The proposal, as it turned out, was this. Clarence Bailey had been running the Bailey Ranch for 6 years, since his father's death had left him with the property, a substantial debt of his own that he had since paid off entirely, and a going cattle operation that he had grown steadily in the intervening years. The Bailey land abutted the Whitfield property along a shared boundary of nearly 3 miles. For the past 2 years, Clarence had been running his cattle across both properties with the informal agreement of Thomas Whitfield, who had been too sick in his final years to manage the land himself, and had been glad of the arrangement. The problem that Harlan Voss's acquisition of the Whitfield acreage would create was not subtle. Voss was a creditor and a land speculator who had been systematically acquiring distressed properties throughout the county for 3 years. He was not a rancher and had no interest in being one. What he wanted was the land itself, which he intended to subdivide and sell off in parcels, most likely to farming interests from back east. That would mean fencing, new boundaries. The creek rights, which were currently shared by informal understanding, becoming contested. Clarence would lose the eastern grazing land his operation had come to depend on, and the natural water access that made the spring and summer grazing cycle viable. Clarence Bailey's proposal was a lease agreement. He proposed to pay a fair annual lease on the Whitfield acreage for a period of 5 years, at a rate sufficient to service the debt payments to both the bank and to Harlan Voss. If Voss would agree to receive payment rather than land, which he might, Clarence said carefully, if the offer came from someone who could make it credibly, meaning someone with a working ranch and a track record of payment. He spread the figures on the table. Lenora had stared at them. This would require Voss to agree to structured payments rather than immediate transfer, she said. Yes. He may not agree. He may not, Clarence said, but I think there's a reasonable chance he will if the offer is properly structured. Harlan Voss is primarily interested in money. The land is a means to money. If I can demonstrate that a payment arrangement yields him more total return than an immediate land sale, which it does when you run the numbers honestly, he has a financial incentive to agree. Lenora had been quiet for a long time looking at the numbers. Then she had looked up at Clarence Bailey and said, "Why does this matter to you? There are other grazing options. You could negotiate water rights separately. What is the real reason you are doing this?" And something happened then that she had not expected. Clarence Bailey did not give her a polished answer. He sat back in his chair, looked at the table for a moment, and then said, "Your father built that land into something. It took him 30 years. The idea of it getting cut up and sold off in 40-acre lots because Harlan Voss held paper on it bothers me considerably." And he paused, and the pause itself carried weight. "Your father told me once that he hoped you'd come back to it someday. He talked about you more than you might think." Lenora had not expected that. She had sat very still for a moment, and then she had said, in a voice that was perhaps less steady than she would have liked, "I didn't come back while he was alive." "I know," Clarence said. And he said nothing else, which was the right thing because there was nothing else that could be said about it. That had been the first day. She had stayed that night in the spare room of the Bailey Ranch house. There was no hotel in Jasper Creek, the nearest being in Caldwell, and Clarence had offered the room with the same plain practicality he seemed to apply to everything, making it easy to accept without feeling obligated. The room was small and clean, with a washstand and a good mattress and a window that looked east toward the Whitfield property, and Lenora had lain awake for a long time watching the stars through the glass and trying to sort out what she was feeling. What she was feeling was difficult. The grief was familiar. She had been living with it since April. But underneath the grief was something she had been trying not to examine, which was the possibility that she had made a series of choices over the past 4 years that had been about running away rather than moving toward, and that the comfortable, contained life she had built in San Antonio was comfortable precisely because it asked nothing of her that she was not already certain she could give. The land asked things of you. That was the truth of it that she had forgotten or tried to forget. It asked your labor and your seasons and your patience and your willingness to be wrong about the weather and the water and 100 other things you could not fully control. It asked you to be present in a way that classrooms did not, where you could maintain a certain professional distance between yourself and the thing you were doing. She did not know yet what she wanted to do. The next morning, Clarence had offered to ride with her across the Whitfield property, and she had accepted, and that was the day that changed everything, though she did not know it while it was happening. They rode out in the early morning when the light was still flat and golden, and the grass was wet with dew, and the air smelled like the particular combination of earth and sage that she had carried without knowing it as a kind of interior scent memory since childhood. Clarence rode beside her without talking much, which she appreciated because she needed to look and not perform the experience of looking. Her father's house was still standing, though it had been empty since spring. It needed work. The porch boards on the south side had rotted, and 2 windows in the east wall were cracked, and the kitchen garden that her mother had kept had gone entirely to seed and weeds, but the structure was sound. The stone chimney that Thomas Whitfield had built with his own hands in the first years was as solid as ever, and the interior, when Clarence unlocked the door and she walked through for the first time since her father's funeral, smelled exactly as it always had. Dust and cedar and something she had no name for that was simply the smell of the place that had been her first world. She stood in the front room for a long time. Clarence stood outside and waited. She came back out with her eyes dry because she had cried in April and had told herself that was done, but her hands were in fists at her sides and she did not unclench them for a full minute. "It needs repair," she said. "Yes," Clarence said. "I can have my men do the porch and the windows if you want. It would take 2 days." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because it's a good house and it shouldn't deteriorate," he said simply. They rode the full boundary of the property over the next 3 hours. Clarence showed her where the fence line had slipped in 2 places on the northern edge, where a section of the creek bank had eroded over a wet spring, where the south pasture had been overrun with mesquite scrub that would need clearing before it would be productive grazing land again. He was not telling her these things to discourage her. She understood that gradually. He was telling her because she had asked him to show her honestly, and he was honoring that, and because he was the kind of man who believed that accurate information was more respectful than comfortable omission. By the time they rode back to the Bailey ranch for midday, Lenora had the beginnings of a different question forming than the one she had arrived with. She had arrived asking, "How do I sign this away cleanly?" The new question was, "What if I didn't?" And that question was terrifying in a way that the first one had not been, because the first one only required her to accept a loss that had already happened, while the new one required her to risk something she was not yet sure she had left. Over the following days, she had told herself she would stay 2 nights, and then found reasons for a third and a fourth. She and Clarence fell into a pattern that she recognized only in retrospect as the pattern of 2 people discovering each other carefully. Mornings he worked the ranch. She sometimes rode out with him, not helping in any practical way initially, but watching and asking questions that he answered with the same direct competence he seemed to bring to everything. She learned that he had come to this land at 22 after his father suffered a stroke that made ranching impossible, that he had grown up partly in this county, and partly in Louisiana where his mother's family was from, which explained a certain quality in his speech that she had noticed but not been able to place. She learned that he read, which surprised her. There were books in the ranch house, actual books, not just almanacs and the Bible, though those were there too, but also Dickens and a battered copy of Darwin's work and several volumes of history that he had clearly read more than once. He learned about her in the same gradual way. That she had been the best student in the county school by the time she was 12, and her father had ridden into Caldwell to find a tutor for her because the school teacher there had said plainly that Lenora had learned everything he knew. That she had come to love teaching with the same quality of love she gave most things, fully, but with a kind of restrained expression of it, as though she was perpetually afraid of loving something so much that losing it would undo her. That she had been engaged once, briefly, at 24, to a man in San Antonio named Robert who had been kind and reliable and had wanted a wife who would be happy inside a modest house, and that she had ended it herself 6 months in, understanding that something in her was not suited to moderate happiness even if she could not name what she wanted instead. Clarence listened to all of this with the same steady attention he gave everything, and when she told him about Robert, he said, "That must have been hard," and then said nothing else, which again was the right thing. On the fourth evening, they sat on the porch of the Bailey house after supper. Ellis had made stew that was considerably better than anything Lenora could have produced in unfamiliar circumstances, and the sky went through its extravagant West Texas performance of color and finally settled into the full dark that was blacker and more star-filled than anything she had ever seen in San Antonio. And Lenora said, "If I agreed to the lease arrangement and tried to maintain the property, what would that actually require of me?" Clarence was quiet for a moment, looking at the dark horizon. "It depends on what you want from it," he said finally. "If you just want to preserve it and cover the debt, you could stay in San Antonio and manage it from a distance, at least for the lease term. The lease income would service the debt and leave a small surplus. I would keep the land in working order. And if I wanted more than that—" He turned to look at her, and for the first time she saw in his face that he was choosing his words with unusual care. "Then you would have to come back to it," he said. "And that's a significant thing to ask of a life you've already built somewhere else." "I built a life that fit," she said quietly. "I'm not sure that's the same as the right life." The silence after that lasted a long time, and it was not uncomfortable. What happened between them did not happen the way she had always imagined things happened in the stories she had read, suddenly and with certainty. It happened in layers, the way the light changed on open land, incrementally and then all at once. The fifth day, she helped him break a young horse. Or rather, she watched the process and asked questions while Clarence worked with a quiet patience that was genuinely remarkable. And when the horse finally allowed itself to be led without resistance, Clarence looked at her with a satisfaction that was entirely without performance, just pure uncomplicated pleasure in a thing done right. And something in her chest shifted in a way that was specifically not just admiration. The sixth day, she spent the morning in her father's house, beginning to inventory what was there and what had been taken, and what needed to be done to make it habitable again. And in the early afternoon, Clarence came over with two of his men, and they began replacing the rotten porch boards without having been asked, and she stood in the doorway and watched. And he looked up once and their eyes met, and she felt the particular acute discomfort of a woman who has decided something without yet admitting it to herself. That evening, he asked her about her mother. It was a question no one asked her, because people who knew the history were either careful about it or did not know how to approach it, and people who did not know the history did not know to ask. Lenora's mother, Catherine Whitfield, had died when Lenora was 19, not from illness but from an accident, a fall from a horse on the west ridge of the property on a morning that had started as an ordinary morning and ended as the dividing line of Lenora's life into before and after. Thomas Whitfield had never fully recovered from it, and neither had Lenora, though she had expressed her not recovery differently, by leaving rather than staying, by pouring herself into work and self-sufficiency and the careful management of her own expectations, until she had made herself into someone who was genuinely capable and genuinely lonely, and had stopped examining the relationship between those two things. She told Clarence all of this. Not in a rush, not dramatically, but in the measured way that she talked when she was being fully honest, which was a quality she had that she sometimes thought of as both her best and most inconvenient characteristic. She told him about the morning her mother died, and about her father's silence afterward, the terrible specific silence of a man who did not know how to grieve in front of his child, and about her own departure 2 years later for San Antonio as an act that had felt like survival, but which she could now see had also been a kind of abandonment, of the land and of her father and of the parts of herself that had grown up rooted in this particular soil. Clarence listened to all of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "You didn't abandon him. You were 19 years old and you were surviving. Those are not the same thing." "I know that intellectually," she said. "There's a difference between knowing something and believing it," he said. The believing takes longer. She looked at him steadily. Do you know that from experience? He looked at the table and then back at her. My father and I didn't part on easy terms. I spent 5 years after he died being angry about things that had nothing to do with him, and then another 2 years understanding that. So yes. What did you do with the understanding? She asked. I put it into the land, he said. That sounds simple, and maybe it is. But I think there are things in people that need somewhere to go that isn't another person, because putting too much of that weight on another person is a way of hurting them. So I put it here. He moved his hand slightly to indicate, she understood, the land around them rather than the house. And it held it. This was one of the most significant things anyone had ever said to her, and she felt it as such with a kind of internal stillness that was different from the emotional flatness she had been maintaining for months. It was the stillness of arrival. She slept that night without lying awake for hours for the first time since she had come to Jasper Creek. The 7th day was when Stoddard the lawyer arrived. He came at 10 in the morning in a buggy from Caldwell, carrying his document case and his wire-rimmed spectacles, and the satisfied expression of a man who believed all the arrangements were already settled. He represented Harlan Voss, and he had come because the deadline on the voluntary transfer was the following day, and when Lenora had not appeared in Caldwell as previously arranged, Voss had sent him to find her and secure the signatures. Stoddard was polite in the way of men who have power over the situation, and therefore have no need to be impolite. He spread the documents on the desk in the front room and explained them clearly and reasonably, and was entirely wrong in his assumption of their context, because Lenora had not told him about Clarence Bailey's proposal, and Clarence had not told anyone because he was not that kind of man. Stoddard tapped the bottom line with his pen. All you need to do is sign there, Miss Whitfield. And Lenora had picked up the pen. She had been about to sign because the weight of accumulated defeat has a momentum that is hard to stop when you are in motion. Because she had told herself for months that this was the practical thing, the only thing, the thing a realistic and unsentimental person would do. Because she was afraid of hoping for something different, and then Clarence came through the door. He put his hand on the documents. Don't, he said. Stoddard made a sound of professional objection. Mr. Bailey, I don't believe you have standing here. This is a matter between Miss Whitfield and her creditors. I have a counter-proposal for Harlan Voss, Clarence said, not looking at the lawyer. He was looking at Lenora. One that was not conveyed to him because the bank held back my letter, which I intend to have words with the bank about. But it doesn't matter now. What matters is that Lenora, he stopped, having used her first name without deciding to, which she noticed, and he noticed that she noticed that Miss Whitfield should not sign anything before she has heard the full picture. Lenora set down the pen. It made a small sound on the wooden desk, but it felt enormous. Mr. Stoddard, she said, I would like to speak with Mr. Bailey privately. If you would please wait outside for a few minutes. Stoddard's professional composure showed the hairline crack of someone who has not been dismissed in a long time. He gathered his composure back with visible effort and said that of course he would wait outside, and then he was outside and the room was quiet. Clarence looked at her. You were about to sign it, he said. Yes. Even though I have been afraid, she said plainly. That is the honest answer. I have been afraid that your proposal fails and I end up in the same place, but having spent another several months hoping and being disappointed. And that hoping and being disappointed might be worse than accepting what is already certain. He moved closer to the desk, not threatening, just bringing himself into the same radius of the conversation as she was in. I think that is a reasonable fear, he said, but I also think you have been afraid of something else for longer than that. And I think that fear is the one that has been making your decisions for the last 4 years. Lenora stared at him. That is a significant thing to say to someone you have known for a week. Yes, he said, it is. And yet you said it. I said it because you deserve to have it said, he answered. I have watched you walk your father's land for 6 days, and I have watched what happens in your face when you are standing on it and not thinking about being watched. And what I see is not someone who has outgrown this place. What I see is someone who came home." She said nothing for a moment. Outside the window, the land lay in its October light, amber and gold and silver where the creek ran, and it was so beautiful that looking at it hurt in the specific way that things you love hurt when you have been denying you love them. "If I don't sign these papers," she said, "and we pursue the counter-proposal, and Voss refuses, I will still lose the land. I will just have lost it later and with more false hope along the way." "That's possible," Clarence said. "But Voss is motivated by money. I've done the calculations 3 times and they are solid. He will receive more total over 5 years in structured payments than he would net from a land sale after his own lawyers take their share. I believe he will agree when he sees the figures. I'm not promising you certainty. I am asking you to give me the chance to try." "Why?" she asked, and it was the same question she had asked on the first day, but it carried more weight now, because they had spent 6 days becoming something to each other that neither of them had named. Clarence Bailey was quiet for a long moment. He looked at his hands, those calloused, competent hands that she had watched work this land all week, and then he looked up. "Because I do not want you to go," he said. It was the simplest possible answer and the most honest, and it landed in her chest like something taking root. She turned and looked out the window at her father's land, her land. She corrected herself with a sudden quiet ferocity and made her decision. "Call Stoddard back in," she said, "and tell him I am not signing today." The next 3 weeks were the most fully alive Lenora Whitfield had felt in years. Clarence rode to Caldwell twice, once to present the counter-proposal to Stoddard and through him to Harlan Voss, and once to follow up when Voss's first response was a counter of his own that tried to reduce the term and increase the interest. There was a period of 4 days when the negotiations were genuinely in doubt, and Lenora kept herself occupied by working on her father's house, because occupying her hands was the only way she knew to manage uncertainty. She was good at it, she discovered, better than she remembered. She could work a room into order with a methodical focus that was satisfying in a way that was different from the satisfaction of teaching, more immediate, the visible result of effort directly translated. Ellis helped her, and the two of them developed a good working rhythm, him explaining what needed doing and her doing it with a thoroughness that earned his visible respect, which mattered to her more than she had expected. Clarence came back from the second Caldwell trip in the late afternoon, rode directly to the Whitfield house where she was working, and said from the doorway, "Voss agreed." She was on her knees cleaning out the fireplace with a brush and a bucket. She looked up at him with ash on her hands and her hair coming loose from its pins. "Completely," she said. "The 5-year term, the interest rate I proposed, the payment schedule." He was fighting something on his face that looked like very significant relief. He drove a hard enough bargain on the payment dates, but the core structure is intact. Lenora sat back on her heels and took a breath that was so deep it felt like she had not been breathing properly for a month. "All right," she said. "All right," he agreed. They looked at each other across the half-cleaned room for a moment, and then she said, "I don't know how to thank you for this." "You don't need to thank me," he said. "It is a good business arrangement that benefits both properties. I get the grazing access I need and you keep your land." "Clarence," she said. He stopped. "I know it's a good business arrangement," she said. "I also know it's more than that." He came into the room and sat down on the wooden chest near the fireplace and looked at her with those gray eyes that she had come to understand were deeper and quieter and more feeling than they first appeared. "Yes," he said, "it is. I need to write to my school in San Antonio," she said. "I need to tell them I won't be returning after the winter term." Something in his expression shifted. Careful, she could see, very careful not to assume. "What will you do?" he asked. "I will live here," she said, "and I will rebuild what my father built, and I will do it properly this time." She paused. "And I think perhaps I would like to do some of that with you, if you are willing to let this be whatever it is." "I am very willing," Clarence said, and the thing that had been carefully controlled in his face released finally into something that was warm and real and directed entirely at her. The winter that followed, was the period in which they fell in love in a way that was so gradual and so complete that it was nearly impossible to say where the falling had begun and the being there had taken over. Lenora moved into her father's house in November, once the most critical repairs were done. She kept her independence with a firm and deliberate hand, cooking her own meals and managing her own finances and making her own decisions about the property, because she had not come back to herself only to hand herself immediately to someone else, and Clarence respected this with a naturalness that made her trust him more than anything deliberate could have. He came to supper twice a week. She came to the Bailey Ranch for Sunday dinner most weeks, gradually becoming part of the easy rhythms of the household in a way that included the ranch hands and Ellis and the whole working organism of the place. She learned things from being there that she had no other way to learn: the specific vocabulary of cattle management, the way a good ranch operated as an interconnected set of relationships between people and land and animals and weather. She was a fast learner, and she threw herself into understanding with the same intellectual appetite she had brought to teaching. In return, she began reading to Clarence in the evenings when they spent time together, because his reading was competent but slow, and there was a whole library of things he had not gotten to. And she loved reading aloud, and sitting in the warm light of one room or the other reading Dickens, while the Texas winter blew cold outside the windows, was one of the simplest and most profound pleasures of her life. The first time he kissed her was in January, after a hard week in which 2 of his best cattle had been lost in a cold snap, and a fence line on the northern boundary had collapsed under ice-weighted wire, and it had taken 4 days of brutal cold weather work to restore it. He had come to her house that Thursday evening exhausted, and she had fed him supper, and they had sat close together on the short sofa that had been her mother's, because the room was cold and the nearness was practical, and she had been reading and he had been listening with his eyes half closed, and at some point she had looked up from the page and found him looking at her with an expression that was too exposed to be comfortable for either of them. She closed the book. He said, very quietly, "May I?" And she said, yes. It was not a dramatic kiss. It was careful and warm and honest, the way he was in all things, and she felt it as the natural conclusion of something that had been in process for months. She wrote to her cousin in Missouri afterward, which was the only person she wrote to about personal matters. "I believe I am in love with a rancher," she wrote. "This was not the plan. I have been forced to revise the plan significantly." Her cousin wrote back, "That sounds like the best kind of revision." February brought a challenge that tested both of them in a way that the romance of falling in love had not yet done. Harlan Voss sent word, through Stoddard, that he had a buyer for a portion of the Whitfield property. Not the whole property, but the southwestern corner of it, about 200 acres, and that he was requesting Lenora's written consent to this partial sale as part of the original debt arrangement, citing a clause in the original debt instrument that Lenora had not read carefully enough when she had first reviewed the documents. She read it very carefully now, 3 times, with the cold focus of a woman who was furious and not going to allow her fury to impair her comprehension. The clause existed. It was real. Voss had the technical right to sell portions of the encumbered acreage to third parties, as long as the proceeds were applied against the debt. She rode to the Bailey Ranch at a speed that was not quite reckless, but that expressed her internal state accurately, dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, and came into the kitchen where Clarence was eating breakfast with a look on her face that brought him immediately to his feet. She explained. She was precise and controlled and very angry. He took the document from her hand and read it himself twice, and she watched his face and saw the same controlled anger she felt, which was not reassuring about the situation but was deeply reassuring about the man. "He may have the right," Clarence said carefully, "but exercising the right and having the right are not the same thing when it comes to negotiations." "What do you mean?" "I mean that Voss entered into an agreement with you on the basis of structured payment in lieu of transfer," Clarence said. If he proceeds with a partial sale without exhausting the payment arrangement first, he opens himself to a legal argument about the good faith of the original agreement. It's not an airtight case, but it is a case, and litigation costs vast money and time. I cannot afford a lawyer, she said flatly. My cousin in Louisiana is a lawyer, Clarence said. He owes me a considerable favor, and I believe he would do this for me at cost, which in practical terms means very little cost to you. She stared at him. You have a lawyer cousin. I do. And you didn't mention this before. There was no occasion to, he said with perfect calm. Would you like me to write to him? She let out a long breath. Yes, she said, please. The letter went out that afternoon. The reply came in 2 weeks. Clarence's cousin, a man named Patrick Bailey, who had studied law in New Orleans and now practiced in Baton Rouge, wrote a meticulous 3-page letter outlining the specific legal vulnerabilities of Voss's position under Texas property law and the terms of the existing agreement, and enclosed a draft letter to Stoddard that laid these out with the quiet lethality of a man who understood how to threaten effectively, without ever quite saying anything that was itself actionable. Lenora read the draft letter 3 times and then said, Your cousin is a remarkable person. He is, Clarence agreed. He is also entirely aware of it. Stoddard received the letter. Voss received it through Stoddard. 10 days later, Stoddard wrote to inform Lenora that Mr. Voss had reconsidered the partial sale and would not be proceeding with it at the present time. Lenora and Clarence rode out together that afternoon to the southwestern corner of the Whitfield property, her property, and stood at the edge of what had nearly been lost, looking at a landscape of mesquite and grass and the particular austere beauty of West Texas in late winter, and she took his hand. He looked at their hands and then at her face. Thank you, she said. I didn't do very much, he said. I sent a letter. You sent 17 letters, she said, counting the ones she knew about, the ones to Voss and to the bank and to the county office and to Patrick in Baton Rouge and to Ellis's brother who knew the fence contractor and half a dozen others she had lost count of. You have been relentless about this. It seemed worth being relentless about, he said. She looked at him for a long moment in that winter light and said what she had been circling for weeks. I am not going back to San Antonio. I want you to know that as a definitive statement, not a provisional one. I am staying here. I am going to make this land into what it should be, and I want to do that with you. Not with you providing assistance from a neighborly distance, but with you, if you want that too. Clarence Bailey looked at her with all the feeling he was capable of, which was considerable, and said, I have wanted that since the morning I rode out with you and watched you look at the creek. That was the 3rd day, she said. Yes, he said. That is very fast, she said. It is, he agreed. I am ordinarily a patient man. With this particular matter I found patience difficult. Spring came in a rush that year, the way springs did in that country, not gradually but all at once. A morning when the air changed temperature, and the grass went from gold to green seemingly overnight, and the creek ran higher with the hill snow melt, and everything smelled of renewal in the most literal possible sense. Lenora had the Whitfield house in good order by March. She had hired a local woman named Mrs. Tanner to help 3 days a week, which she had been resistant to initially. She was not yet of a financial position to be casual about expenditures, but which proved wise because Mrs. Tanner was 60 years old and had known Thomas Whitfield, and told Lenora stories about her father that she had never heard, small stories, ordinary ones, that filled in parts of the man she had known with parts of the man he had been when she was not watching, and this was an unexpected and quietly profound gift. She planted the kitchen garden herself in March, following the beds her mother had laid out, which were still vaguely visible in the soil if you knew where to look. She planted beans and tomatoes and squash and a row of sunflowers along the east side because her mother had always grown them there, and watching the first seedlings come up in April was a satisfaction that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with continuity. Clarence asked her to marry him in April. He asked her on a Sunday afternoon on the porch of the Bailey Ranch house, where they had developed the habit of sitting after the Sunday dinner when the day was warm enough, and he asked her the way he did everything that mattered simply and directly, without excessive preamble. "I love you," he said. "I would like you to be my wife. I want to be clear that this has nothing to do with the lease arrangement or the property, which is yours absolutely, and I would not presume to conflate those two things. This is purely a question about whether you would want to share your life with me." Lenora had been looking at the land, and then she looked at him. "I love you too," she said. "And yes, I would very much like to share my life with you." He exhaled in a way that told her he had been genuinely uncertain of her answer, which she found endearing and also somewhat astonishing, since she had thought she had been fairly transparent about her feelings for at least 2 months. "I want to keep my house," she said. "For a time, at least. I want to finish what I've started with it, and then we can decide together where we live." "Of course," he said, "whatever you want. And I would like Patrick to come for the wedding," she said, because she had been corresponding with Clarence's cousin since the Voss matter and had come to like him enormously. "He will be delighted," Clarence said. "He has been asking me inappropriate questions about you in every letter for 6 weeks." "What kind of inappropriate questions?" "The kind that make clear he already considers you part of the family." She smiled at that. It was a full smile, the kind she had become better at allowing herself, and she saw it land on him the way it always did. They married in June of 1883. The wedding was in the Jasper Creek church, a small building with a good bell that the congregation had bought the previous year and were still quietly proud of. The minister was a man named Reverend Howell, who had a warm, plain manner and no inclination toward the ceremonial flourishes that sometimes made Lenora impatient. Patrick Bailey came from Baton Rouge in a good suit, and was exactly as she had expected from his letters, sharp and funny, and kind underneath both of those things. Ellis stood at the back of the church with his hat in his hand, and an expression of satisfaction so profound it was nearly paternal. Lenora wore a dress she had made herself, ivory cotton with pale blue trim, nothing elaborate, but well cut and fitted to her actual body rather than to a fashionable silhouette, and she had braided flowers from the Whitfield garden into her hair. She thought about her mother while she dressed, and she thought about her father, and she let herself feel both of those things without bracing against them, which was a small act of progress. She walked to the altar of her own volition without anyone to give her away, because she was a grown woman of 27 who was choosing this with full awareness, and did not require the ceremony of being transferred from one male custodian to another. Reverend Howell did not remark on this. Clarence saw her come through the door, and his face did what she had learned to read over the past several months, the particular quality of his attention that was total and specific only to her. The vows were the traditional ones. She said them carefully, meaning each word. After the ceremony, there was a gathering at the Bailey Ranch, which was the larger property for entertaining, with food brought by half the county because hospitality in Jasper Creek operated on the principle that events of significance required community participation, and the tables in the yard were loaded with things people had made and brought as both gift and presents. The evening was warm, and the sky performed its usual extravagance of color and then stars, and Lenora sat beside her husband. That word was new and strange, and she was already fond of it, and watched the people around her and felt something she wanted to identify correctly. It was not happiness exactly, or not only happiness. It was belonging, the specific sensation of being in the right place with the right person at the right time, which she had spent 27 years not quite locating, and which was both simpler and more complete than she had imagined it would be. She told Clarence this quietly later. "I know," he said. "I feel it too." "Did you feel it before this?" she asked. "Before I came." He thought about it honestly, which was characteristic. "I felt the absence of it," he said. "I had built something here that I was proud of, and it was good work. But there was something in it that was for keeping rather than for sharing, and keeping something good only for yourself starts to hollow after a while. When you really came, not just to sign papers but to actually see the land. Something in the shape of this place changed. She leaned against him, which was a gesture of such habitual comfort already that it felt as though she had always done it. "We should talk about what happens when the lease term ends," she said. "In 4 years." "I have thoughts about that," he said. "I thought you might. The most logical thing when the debt is settled is to consolidate the operations," he said. "The two properties operating as one unit is more efficient, and the combined grazing is sustainable in a way that neither is entirely alone. We could run a significantly larger herd, manage the water rights together, and the shared boundary fence becomes essentially irrelevant." "And the Whitfield house," she said. "Yours," he said immediately. "Always. It can be whatever you want it to be. A house for guests, a place for your own work, whatever you decide." She was quiet for a moment. "I was thinking it might be a school," she said. He turned to look at her. "A school. There are 30 children in this county who ride to Caldwell for schooling or don't have any," she said. "The house is large enough to serve as a classroom and a teacher's residence. If we could find a teacher willing to come out here, it would serve the whole community." Clarence looked at her with an expression that was not surprise exactly, but its more evolved form, which was the recognition of a person you love revealing yet another dimension you had not anticipated. "That is a remarkable idea," he said. "I have been thinking about it since February," she admitted. "I wanted to see if I still thought it was good after a few months." "Do you?" "Yes," she said. "Even more so." They talked about it for the rest of the evening, and it joined the list of things they were building together. The first year of their marriage was full in the way that Lenora had not known life could be full, not busy, which was a different thing, but genuinely occupied with work that mattered and people she loved, and a rhythm of days that had texture and meaning. The ranch work expanded as Clarence had planned, the combined operation beginning to take shape as something more significant than either property had been alone. Lenora learned cattle work in the practical way, by doing it rather than theorizing it, and while she had no illusions about replacing a trained ranch hand, she became competent and useful in ways that gave her specific satisfactions. She wrote letters, many letters, to her cousin in Missouri, to Patrick in Baton Rouge, to several people she had known in San Antonio who wrote back with the mixture of bewilderment and vicarious pleasure that city dwellers often felt at accounts of frontier life. She wrote to the Texas State Board of Education about the possibility of establishing a rural school in Jasper Creek County, which required filling out forms of considerable tedium, and exchanging several letters with a functionary in Austin who was professionally unhelpful but not, ultimately, an obstacle. She also discovered in August of that first year that she was pregnant. She sat with this knowledge for 2 days before telling Clarence, not from fear or hesitation, but from the desire to understand what she felt about it before she put it into language. What she felt, she determined, was primarily a kind of startled gratitude that was adjacent to joy and moving toward it rapidly. The secondary feeling was a practical concern about timing and logistics, which was consistent with her character, and which she addressed by making a list. She told him on a Tuesday evening after supper, sitting on the porch of the Bailey house, their house. She was still pleasantly surprised by this, and she told him plainly, "I am going to have a baby in the spring, from my calculation." Clarence put down his coffee cup very carefully, the way people do when their hands need something careful to do with themselves, and looked at her with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. It was unguarded in a way that the competent, steady exterior of the man rarely permitted, an expression that was made entirely of love and wonder, and something that might have been, around the edges, a little bit of fear, which was entirely appropriate. "Are you well?" he asked first. "Perfectly well," she said. "Somewhat tired in the mornings, but nothing more than that." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand, and she let him hold it, and they sat like that for a good while without talking, which was one of the best things about them, that they had long since established that silence between them was not a failure of communication but a form of it. "I was hoping," he said finally, that this would happen. I know, she said. You were not subtle about it. I thought I was quite subtle, he said, which made her laugh. Their son was born in March of 1884, which was, she thought, the right time, a spring birth, the land renewing itself around them, everything in alignment. They named him Thomas after her father, because it was right, and because Clarence had suggested it without her having to. Thomas Bailey came into the world in the bedroom of the ranch house, with a midwife from Caldwell named Mrs. Bauer, who was brisk and skilled and kind in a strictly professional way. And Clarence, who had been told by every man he knew that husbands waited outside, had sat in the room the entire time, holding Lenora's hand when she needed it and staying out of the way when she didn't, which she had required of him, and which he had done without complaint. She held Thomas for the first time and thought about her own mother holding her, and about her father holding her, and about all the hands that had brought people into this world in this part of this country, and the weight of it was not heavy but was enormously, specifically real. Clarence held his son with the same steadiness he brought to everything, looking at the small face with an expression that was all the way open. "Hello," he said to Thomas, in a voice that was barely a murmur. "We have been waiting for you." Thomas Bailey grew in the way of babies, faster than seemed possible, and with a constant series of revelations. He was, from very early, a person of clear opinions and physical curiosity, and these were qualities both his parents recognized in themselves and were secretly delighted to see combined and magnified in someone new. The ranch grew too. By the end of 1884, with the first full year of the consolidated operation complete, Clarence's projections had proved accurate, and then some. The combined herd was the strongest in the county. The water rights, managed properly across both properties, gave them advantages in dry summers that their neighbors struggled with. The Jasper Creek name, which had previously referred to the geographic feature, became associated also with the Bailey operation, which people in the county began calling the Jasper Creek Ranch as a convenience, and which Clarence and Lenora adopted formally as the name on their partnership documents because it suited them. It was hers as much as his, and it was the land's. The Whitfield house became the school in 1885, when the lease payments to Harlan Voss were ahead of schedule, and the County Education Board finally sent its approval. Lenora found the teacher herself, a young woman named Alice Crane from Dallas who was 22 and sharp as a new nail, and willing to come to Jasper Creek, because the position included a real house and a real salary, and because Alice Crane was the kind of person who believed in going where she was needed. Lenora had ridden past the Whitfield house on the morning Alice arrived, and felt something about it that was clean and good. Her mother's kitchen garden out the east side, the porch boards solid and new, the bell they had hung above the door ringing in the morning wind, and 30 children arriving from across the county to learn in the house where Lenora herself had learned the shape of the world. Harlan Voss received his final payment in the spring of 1886. Stoddard brought the discharge documents himself, which was perhaps an attempt at graciousness that Lenora chose to receive as such. She signed her name to the discharge with a very different quality of hand than had been present when she had sat at this same desk 3.5 years earlier, about to sign away everything. The pen was the same weight. The hand was the same hand, but nothing else was the same. She was 29 years old and she was home. The bank released the final lien in June of that same year, and the Whitfield property, all 1,700 acres of it, was hers, free and clear, combined with the adjacent Bailey land into the Jasper Creek Ranch operation that ran, by now, the finest cattle in 3 counties, and employed 6 permanent ranch hands and 2 seasonal ones, and provided a livelihood that was not just surviving but genuinely thriving. That summer, Clarence came to her with a look she recognized as his planning face, the specific expression of a man who has been turning an idea over for several weeks before saying it out loud. "I would like to build something," he said. "What kind of something?" "A new house," he said, on the ridge between the two properties, the place where we can see both land sections from the porch. He showed her a sketch he had made, which was rough but showed the shape of what he imagined a proper house, larger than either of the existing ones, built for a family and for the long future rather than just for the immediate present. She looked at the sketch for a long time. "My father's house is the school now," she said. "Yes. And this ranch house is yours, your family's." "Ours," he corrected quietly. "Ours," she agreed. "But a house built by both of us, on the line between both our histories, would be something different." "That's what I was thinking," he said. "Let's do it," she said. They broke ground in August and the house took until the following spring to build properly, because they were not in a hurry, and because doing it right mattered more than doing it fast. Clarence worked alongside the builder every day he could, which was most of them, and Lenora made the design decisions with the same methodical care she brought to everything. A kitchen that was serious about being a kitchen, a library with actual shelves for actual books, a bedroom that faced east because she wanted to wake to the light coming over her father's land, a porch that ran the full length of the south side and could hold a family of considerable size. Thomas was 2 when they moved in, old enough to find the whole proceeding enormously exciting, young enough that the new house would be the only house he had memory of. He had his father's steady gray eyes and his mother's uncompromising quality of attention, and he moved through the world with a confidence that was still in its early formation but already unmistakable. "He will be a great deal of trouble when he is older," Lenora said one evening, watching Thomas navigate the new porch with the focus of an explorer. "Absolutely," Clarence agreed. "I am looking forward to it." Lenora discovered she was pregnant again in the autumn of 1886. She told Clarence on the same porch in the same way she had told him about Thomas, plainly, on a Tuesday evening, with his coffee cup needing something careful to do. He looked at her with the same unguarded expression and said, "Are you well?" First, which she had expected and loved him for. "Perfectly well," she said, which was entirely true. She was not tired this time, or not particularly. She felt very much herself, which she had come to understand was the truest measure of her own health. Their daughter was born in May of 1887, and they named her Catherine after Lenora's mother, which was Lenora's choice, and which Clarence received with the particular quality of attentiveness that meant he understood exactly how much it meant. Catherine Bailey was a very different creature from her brother, quieter in temperament, but absolutely not in volume when she required something, with her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes, and a quality of focus that Lenora recognized as specifically her own inheritance. The family of 4 occupied the Ridge House with the comfortable fullness of people who have built something specifically for the purpose of filling it with life. Patrick came from Baton Rouge in 1887 for a summer visit that extended to 3 months because Jasper Creek disagreed with his original intention to leave it promptly. He fell into a friendship with Alice Crane, the school teacher, that everyone could see was more than friendship within about 4 days, but which they both treated with elaborate professional respect for several weeks before Lenora said something direct to Alice and Clarence said something direct to Patrick, and the situation resolved itself with considerable efficiency into an understanding that led, by winter, to Patrick Bailey relocating his law practice to Caldwell and Alice Crane becoming Alice Bailey the following spring. "You manipulated that," Clarence said to Lenora. "I offered clarity to 2 people who had confused themselves unnecessarily," she said. "That is not manipulation. That is a public service." He smiled. She loved his smile, which was still somewhat rare and therefore worth a great deal. Ellis retired from active ranch work in 1888 and spent his days doing exactly what he wanted, which turned out to be woodworking, and the Jasper Creek Ranch became somewhat overrun with extremely well-made chairs and tables and carved items of every description, which everyone in the household accepted as the natural consequence of honoring someone who had earned his rest. The school at the Whitfield house expanded. By 1888, Alice had a second teacher assisting her, a man who had studied in Tennessee and was glad of the quiet county posting. And the building had been extended with a second classroom that the county helped fund, and that Lenora had personally lobbied for in 2 trips to Austin, once with Thomas on her hip and once with Catherine, because she had learned that legislators were more forthcoming when confronted with the specific reality of the children they were abstractly providing for. The school became what she had imagined it could be, a genuine educational institution for the children of the county, serving families who had previously had nothing or very little, giving children the kind of beginning that she had been given by fortune and her father's determination, and that she believed every child deserved. She also continued to write. Not for publication, not formally. She had no pretensions in that direction, but extensively in the journals she kept, which were a record of the land and the seasons and the animals and the children and the people and the days. She wrote about the drought year of 1887 and how they had managed the water, and about the hard freeze of 1886 that had taken 24 cattle and required 3 weeks of brutal recovery work, and about the good years too, the years when the grass was plentiful and the herd flourished, and the land seemed to expand in its generosity. She wrote about Clarence in these journals, though not sentimentally, because she was not a sentimental writer. She wrote about him the way you write about something central, the way you write about weather or water, as a presence that shaped everything around it without requiring constant description. He was, she wrote once, the most honest person she had known. Not honest in a rigid or painful way, but honest in the way that good land is honest. It shows you what it is without pretending to be something else, and in doing so gives you something to build on that will actually hold. She had come to Jasper Creek to sign away everything she was afraid of wanting. She had left eventually, after months and years and a whole life built, because the rancher had made her feel it was worth keeping. Not just the land. She thought about this sometimes, sitting on the south porch in the early morning when the light was the same amber gold of that October morning, when she had first ridden out with him, Thomas and Catherine still sleeping inside, Clarence somewhere in the near distance doing the first work of the day. Not just the land, though the land was part of it, deeply and specifically part of it, but the self she had been afraid to bring back to this place. The part of her that was her father's daughter and her mother's daughter, and belonged to this particular soil and sky. That was what she had nearly signed away, and what she had kept. Clarence came around the corner of the house in the early morning light, work gloves on, hat pushed back on his head, and saw her on the porch with her coffee, and he stopped. He had been doing this for years. She had noticed stopping when he saw her, as though the sight required a moment to properly receive. "You're up early," he said. "I was thinking," she said. "About what?" She considered the question seriously. "About how different this is from what I thought my life would be," she said. "And how much better different is." He came to the porch and sat beside her in the way they had been sitting beside each other for years now, the specific comfortable proximity of people who have chosen each other through all weathers and found the choice confirmed repeatedly. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was a question he asked her occasionally, not from anxiety, but from the genuine interest of a man who cared to know the true answer rather than the comfortable one. "Yes," she said, with the full weight of someone who has checked the word carefully against its meaning and found the match accurate. "Very." He took her hand in the way he had taken it years ago on the southwestern corner of the Whitfield land in the winter, and she let him hold it, and they looked at the morning together, the amber grass, the silver creek, the horses moving in the distance, the smoke beginning to rise from the school chimney where Alice's new teacher was stoking the morning fire. Their life, spread across 1,700 acres and the adjacent Bailey land, inhabited by people they loved and work they believed in, and the particular knowledge that had come from staying. Thomas appeared in the doorway at 6 years old, hair standing in several directions, looking at them with the focused intensity of someone who has just had a thought and wants to share it immediately. "Papa," he said, "Can I ride with you today?" Clarence looked at his son and then at Lenora, and she saw in his face that particular quality of joy that was most like home to her, uncomplicated and complete. "Yes," Clarence said. "Go put your boots on." Thomas disappeared inside with the urgency of a child given permission. Catherine's voice could be heard from the back of the house, awake and requiring attention, and Lenora rose to go to her, and Clarence rose to go to Thomas, and for a moment they stood facing each other in the morning light with the whole life they had built spreading in all directions around them. "I'll be back for breakfast," he said. "I'll make biscuits," she said, which was not a domestic concession but a specific pleasure she had developed a genuine fondness for and made exceptionally well, a fact which Clarence recognized in the small nod he gave. She watched him go. She let herself watch without turning away, the way she had learned to let herself want things without bracing against the wanting, his particular walk, the set of his shoulders, the way he turned once to look back at her because he always turned once. She went inside to her daughter and her morning and her life. Outside, the Jasper Creek ranch lay in the early October light. They were 4 years now from that first October, and each year the land was more fully hers and more fully theirs, and the amber grass moved in a warm breeze off the southwest, and the creek ran clear and cold over its limestone bed, and every acre of it was a thing she had chosen to keep. She had not known, when she set down that pen, exactly what she was keeping. She knew now. She was keeping the possibility of a life that was large enough for the full person she was. She was keeping the inheritance of a father who had loved her and had hoped she would come back, and who had, through the unlikely chain of debt and grief and one plain-spoken letter from a rancher with steady gray eyes, been proven right. She was keeping the land that her mother had walked and tended and loved, which now housed a school and 30 children who were learning the shape of the world in rooms that still smelled of cedar, and the good work of people who had come before. She was keeping Clarence, which was the word that contained all the other words, the way the ridge between the two properties contained them both, the place where their separate histories met and continued together as one unbroken thing. Catherine called from the back room with the specific insistence of a 20-month-old who has decided the morning should begin immediately, and Lenora went to her, smiling, which was not a performance but simply the face of a woman in the right place. The morning light came through the east-facing window of the bedroom exactly as she had planned it, falling across the wooden floor in a long, warm rectangle, and Jasper Creek moved outside in its clear and constant voice, and everything she had nearly given away was everywhere around her, solid and present and entirely, irrevocably hers.